today's panel discussion, Parking in the Space Between Buildings, looks at the challenges and opportunities of parking reform in the US as we hear from different stakeholders. It builds on the discussion from the first part of the series, during which we heard about the processes of shifting the car-dominated paradigm. This webinar also draws on the recently published paper, Ideas to Accelerate Parking Reform in the United States, and the perspectives of different experts. So now I will go ahead and introduce the panelists. We are joined by Martha Roskovsky, who is the lead author of the report. She's an independent consultant helping cities implement sustainable mobility systems, complete streets, and programs. She will moderate today's discussion. Our first panelist, Lindsey Bailey, works at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, focusing on equitable transportation and parking policy. She is also a co-founder of Parking Reform Network, a public benefit nonprofit organization with the goal of educating the public about parking policy and assisting others with parking reform. Our second panelist, Hank Wilson, joins us from the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, where he leads the curb management team working on policy and regulation for the city's curb space. And finally, we are joined by Michael Kodransky, who is the director of the US program at ITDP, spearheading projects in Boston and Los Angeles, focusing on equitable transportation. So I will first go ahead and turn it over to Michael Kodransky to start us with a little bit of context for today's event before turning over to Martha and the panelists. So Michael, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Ivona. We're thrilled to host this discussion today and to have collaborated with Martha on her report, Ideas for Accelerating Parking Reform in the US, because in fact, ITDP has worked on parking reform around the world for over 10 years to address climate change and equity. And we actually did see some success in our effort in a multitude of regions. So in Mexico City, we worked on the Eco Park on-street parking program. And in Guangzhou, China, and in Beijing, and in Chennai, India, we worked on on-street parking. And historically, we have focused on improving bus systems, improving cycling infrastructure, improving public spaces, and creating more space for walking. And we understood that there is a link between managing parking and being able to provide all of these other types of infrastructure, as there is a trade-off that is made in deciding on how to regulate parking and manage it and price it. And so we've come out with a host of resources for cities to use in thinking about how to properly manage their parking systems. We've collected a series of best practices from around the world, and we see that there is a huge opportunity to still seriously impact parking from a climate, from an equity, from a spatial justice perspective in the US. The US has hundreds of millions of parking spaces. And in fact, right now, we have come to about the 100th anniversary since cities decided to create regulations to put parking out of the street into buildings. So it's about 100 years since we decided, okay, we want these vehicles out of sight and out of mind, but we never actually got the on-street parking properly managed. And so the host of problems that came out of that have not sufficiently been addressed. And so this discussion today and Martha's report, which was supported by the Summit Foundation, begins to unpack some of the ideas of how do we take this policy area, which often has a lot of very vocal naysayers and opponents, and do something about it for the benefit and the livability of cities. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Martha and the other panelists.
Thanks, Michael. You know, I joke that all roads lead to parking. And like Michael says, it's one of the most recalcitrant issues that we deal with in the whole world of mobility and housing and urban design. I will say, maybe I'm just a born optimist, but I think we're making progress. You know, we do see change. Things are happening. It is not an easy topic at all, and it probably will not ever be an easy topic, that people just get worked up about parking because it's so personal. It affects them so immediately. But we are here today with a couple of great panelists to talk about the on-street side of parking. You know, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about parking and housing policy, off-street parking, permitting. I would say the sister field is sort of the on-street management. What are we doing with parking on the streets? And I just want to welcome everybody to this webinar. You know, thank you to ITDP for hosting it. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks to all of you who are, you know, part of the parking tribe, the crew that are really thinking deeply about parking, thinking about change. I know Tony Jordan is on here from the Parking Reform Network, and you know, it's kind of crazy that we're still funding parking advocacy around parking, basically with, you know, crowdsourcing and bake sales, but we're making progress. So without further ado, let's dive in. Our two panelists are going to give you a little context, introduce themselves, who they are, what they're working on, and then we have some questions. So let's start with Hank. Hank, tell us about your work in San Francisco.
Thanks, Martha, and thanks everybody for having me. I'm excited to be here. My name is Hank Wilson. I am the policy manager for our parking and curb management team at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. And in San Francisco, we have a unique setup where the Department of Transportation and the Public Transit Agency are one. They were united by a vote of the San Francisco voters back in 1999. So we're more than 20 years in now. And the idea was that we're all part of sort of one system of trying to get people around safely and efficiently. And perhaps the biggest innovation was that excess parking revenues that are generated both from the off-street properties that we own and the charging for permits and for parking on the street go to fund our transit system. So it's a fairly equitable system that makes a lot of sense, since especially in a place like San Francisco, folks who drive tend to be higher income than folks who take the bus and take the train. And so my job and the job of my team is to regulate both the loading and the parking all over the city. We have about 280,000 on-street parking spaces in San Francisco. About 28,000 of them, or 10%, are regulated with parking meters, so you have to pay. Those are sort of our downtown and commercial districts. And so our job, again, is to regulate those and to try to find ways to ensure that we're keeping people moving safely and efficiently. The curb management part of my title and of the team's title was added just a couple of years ago, I think, in recognition of the fact that managing the curb is an extremely important way to make streets safer and more efficient, and that parking is really just one kind of curb management, and in a lot of ways it's the least useful, it's the least efficient way to use the curb. So I can talk a lot more about some of the policies that we've passed and some of the regulations that we've created, but excited to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Hank. Lindsey from the center of the country, Chicago.
Hello, and thank you for having me here today. I just have to say, if you haven't read Martha's report, it's a really excellent paper and I recommend it, but I'm happy to be here. And as mentioned, I am at the Chicago's Metropolitan Planning Organization, CMAP, and in our role as a regional transportation planning organization, we don't have that on the ground implementation authority. So a lot of my work is really helping to change hearts and minds and get the discussion out in the communities, and doing technical assistance to do parking studies at the local level. But I really feel like, you know, as Martha pointed out, parking is so personal, and, you know, you can throw the facts and the data out, but you really need to walk people through changes on the street to get that implementation possibility. And over the years, as I've been talking about parking and presenting at different conferences, I've really benefited from hearing other professionals in this very difficult area, and we've shared resources. And when I met Tony Jordan and he had this idea to start the Parking Reform Network, I was very excited about it, because I think, so I joined on as a co-founder, we launched last year, And we really want to see equitable and sustainable cities that aren't constrained by parking policies, so that we can actually have a more stable climate and fair access to abundant and affordable housing and safer streets. And we can bring together a lot of different issue activists through parking. And so that's why I'm there.
That's great. I'm a proud member as well. So let's start really big picture. It seems like when we start talking about issues in cities and what we're doing, there's twin themes of climate and equity that come up. So I want you to please help us connect the dots between parking and climate. And tell me, is that an argument that resonates in your community, knowing that, every place is unique and there's different dynamics? Who wants to start? How about Lindsey? Does climate, clearly we can connect the dots. We can show how parking affects climate, how those are linked. But does that work in Chicago? Do you use that argument? Is that part of the narrative?
I find that the climate argument is going to work better with younger audiences. But a lot of times I am out in smaller communities, they'll be more conservative, and that is not the winning argument that I put forward first. Usually I focus more on the economic side of parking, because so many of our smaller municipalities are really even struggling to maintain the infrastructure that they have. And in places where it is congested and there seems to not be enough parking, they're trying to think of how they can accommodate more cars, and they're not able to pay for what they already have. So looking at it from the economic side tends to be more productive of a discussion. And so while the climate goal is part of it and resilience to a more sustainable future, it's not quite like, I feel like Hank might have it in California, where we have increased rainfall and flooding. We are seeing record-breaking temperatures, but it's not quite at the front of everybody's mind.
How about the left coast?
Yeah, I think for better or for worse, climate change is more at the front of people's mind in California, especially with wildfire season, getting longer and scarier. And the drought that has afflicted the state for the past few years. People in California, if they believe in climate change, which most of them do, then they can really see it. There are already climate refugees out there. I have friends who have moved away from California because of wildfire season and because of the impacts of climate change. So we're sort of at the vanguard of that. And so I think the climate change connection is more apparent to people here, especially in San Francisco. But I do think that drawing that connection over and over and repeatedly I view as kind of one of my jobs, and one of the jobs of the folks who regulate parking and kind of set parking policy going forward, to say, our city council just passed a climate emergency resolution that says we have to do everything we can. We have to reduce emissions, down to 60% of 1990 levels by 2030, those sorts of things. And making that connection that you believe in that, right? Like, you agree that we have a climate emergency. And so if we have a climate emergency, then we can't just build that new parking garage and try to accommodate 1,000 new cars, or, we can't keep that parking free and expect everyone to be able to drive to that location. And I think trying to draw a connection to the shared sacrifice that people are much more willing, certainly in San Francisco, to make to try to combat climate change. Like, you need to change the way you live. You need to stop using plastic bags. You need to, you need to get an electric stove instead of a gas stove. All these kinds of things that people are perfectly willing to discuss as sacrifices and changes that they need to make. And to say, if you want to do that, actually the bigger thing that you could do is, drive less, take the bus more, ride your bike more. So that's the connection. I think it's starting to get some traction.
Wow. In Colorado, I've been working with the Colorado DOT, and they will not talk about behavior change. They just will not talk about the need to drive less. Lindsey?
I feel like there's so much resistance to changing the status quo. We hear more about electric vehicles as being some sort of solution without that real conversation about making it so that in our communities, you don't have to drive for every trip. And there are little changes we can do to push that. And a lot of them, the behavior changes can really be impacted by the parking policies.
Yeah. So let's talk about the equity question. I think we're all aware of the really deep inequities that exist in our society today, historically, the disproportionate impacts. I know within government, there's a real sensitivity and concern about it. I also feel like whenever an idea comes up, someone's going to say, well, it wouldn't be fair to poor people, so we can't do it. And I think sometimes that comes from a really deep concern about what are the impacts. Other times it just feels like it's an excuse to not do anything. It's a convenient way to say, rather than saying, I don't like that idea, they sort of push it over there. Can you talk a little bit about how parking, especially on-street parking, the connections are clearly tighter with housing and off-street parking. You can make that argument really clearly. How do those concepts of equity feed into the work that you're doing with on-street parking?
Well, I'm unmuted, so I'll just go ahead.
Go.
So I know that many of us are hoping for that more sustainable, resilient, equitable communities, and we envision a shift away from auto dependency. But in a lot of cases, we're really far from that reality. And making changes and improving walking, biking, and transit would immediately benefit a lot of lower income people. There are places where having a car can really mean the difference between having access to a decent job or being able to drop your kids off at daycare or feeling safe traveling at all hours. So I think it is going to be really context dependent of how you're addressing equity. But we can't just say that poor people own fewer cars, so if we make it more expensive to drive, then it's overall a good thing. But at the same time, as I feel like you're implying, our current system is very inequitable, and it really favors those who are wealthy enough to own and maintain a vehicle, and that's at the expense of people who do not drive or cannot drive. But having a lack of access to a car can also exacerbate the inequities that we see. So in some places, there's going to be a need for a combination of improving access to cars and regulating their use. And I think the on-street parking policies can get at that. And when I say increasing access to cars, it could be vehicle sharing, other things like that. So that's sort of my take on equity.
Hank?
But it's deep, and our government policies really created a lot of these inequities, using our transportation dollars to facilitate white flight out of cities at the expense of the Black and brown neighborhoods. So there's a lot that we need to do to fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Lindsey says. I think from the San Francisco perspective, we do to sort of build on what Lindsey was saying. There is indeed nowadays, you've seen this, the Great Inversion, where folks who have money and have means are choosing to live in walkable, transit-rich areas, and that means that folks who don't are forced out and are forced to live in places that are less transit-rich, that are more car-dependent, and oftentimes they have jobs that require getting to either driving back into the city or driving to some even further flung location that is less transit accessible. So it's certainly a real concern. It's something that we think about a lot. But I think from an on-street perspective, like the specifics of what, regulating on-street parking in San Francisco, San Francisco has a much more robust transit system than most places in the United States. So there really are options for people to get around. And so when you prioritize private car parking, you're taking that away from all the other uses on the street, and specifically from transit. And again, in San Francisco, the demographics, the average incomes of folks who drive is much, much higher than the average incomes of folks who take transit. And so to the extent that we are, and you see fights like this around the city where we don't want to create transit lanes or transit stops or bulb outs that make the bus go faster, because it's going to take away parking, and that means that lower income folks are basically pushed to the end of the line. And the other thing is that that I don't think gets as much discussion, but it's certainly true in San Francisco, is that the victims of traffic violence, the folks who are being hit by cars, also tend to be poor. They tend to be from immigrant communities. They tend to be older, folks who don't speak English as a first language, that sort of thing. And so, again, to the extent that we are making space for cars, which parking does, and encouraging more driving, which parking does, then we are risking the lives and the health of folks in our poorer communities and in our disadvantaged and marginalized communities. And then the last thing I'll say is that there's a really strong connection to the climate change issue too. And I think, tragically, Hurricane Ida is an example of this, where when you have flooding, it floods the basement apartments and kills people who live in the basement apartments, or destroys their apartments. And who is that lives in those apartments? It's folks on the margins. And so, to the extent that we are continuing to create these extreme weather events and all of the impacts that those cause, then that's going to impact marginalized communities a lot more.
Yeah, thank you. That's a big topic. All right, let's move on. So we want to talk about San Francisco and Chicago. San Francisco launched SF Park 10 years ago, a really innovative, data-driven dive into parking pricing. Chicago sold off all of their on-street parking in the deal of the century. So let's dive a little bit into those. Hank, why don't you start? Because I think yours is a little more cheerful than Chicago's story, which to me is more of a cautionary tale. Tell us what SF Park was, kind of the major, what were the most valuable pieces of SF Park?
So SF Park has a special place in my heart, because it was the first. I was a lawyer before I was a transportation planner, and SF Park was the first thing that I worked on when I changed careers back 10 years ago. And essentially, it was the first, and to a certain extent still the only major city to set pricing on the model hypothesized by Professor Donald Shoup from UCLA, that we should price parking based on demand. We should look at how much are people using it, and if people are using it a lot, then the price should go up. If people aren't using it that much, then the price should go down, and that will naturally set the price that creates a couple of open spaces on every block, which then makes the streets much safer and more efficient, because when people arrive, they can get to a parking space right away, and they don't have to circle around and cause all sorts of excess traffic even after they've already arrived at the destination. It's just completely wasted traffic. It's wasted GHG emissions and miles traveled and all that sort of stuff. And it's unsafe. It gets in the way of the bus. It gets in the way of people on bikes. It's distracted driving, because people are looking for parking rather than looking where they're going. And so that's the idea, is that it would sort of eliminate or reduce a lot of those challenges. And so the way that the pilot worked is we implemented it at a quarter of the spaces in San Francisco, so about 7,000 across the city in several different neighborhoods. Put parking sensors, little hockey puck shaped things, in each space to tell us when parking was available and where, and then use that data to price parking. And then did a really robust evaluation, which I could put in the chat. It's 150 or 200 pages long, evaluating the success of the program from all different dimensions. And the overall conclusion was that it worked. We had pilot areas and control areas, and in the pilot areas, that key metric of parking availability went up substantially. And the sort of follow-on metrics like parking search time, greenhouse gas emissions, all dropped pretty substantially when compared to the control areas. So that was obviously a success and an important finding. But one of the things that we also evaluated, and I think an interesting takeaway, is that this was all, SF Park was really about sort of getting that last 10 or 5 or 10% right. Like, we've already priced the parking in these locations, and now we're just going to set the price more effectively. But in days and in times and in places where we went from no price at all to a price, we probably got 85 to 90% of the benefit. Just pricing the parking at all created the availability, it reduced the circling, it reduced the greenhouse gas emissions. So we analyzed the city did parking on Sundays, metered parking, paid parking on Sundays, which hadn't been in existence before. In some neighborhoods, we extended the hours of parking into the evenings. And in some places, we actually added paid parking at blocks that didn't have it before. And in all those situations, we saw tremendous gains. So anyway, it's sort of a lesson for other cities. Even if you don't have the money to put parking sensors in every space or cameras in every space or buy parking meters that are wirelessly connected and all that, you don't really need that to get much of the benefit. You just need to have the political will to actually price parking at all.
I think that's a great takeaway, because San Francisco got a federal grant to do SF Park, right?
Yes, a pretty substantial one. $20 million, and then another $20 million from our local MPO actually. So $40 million to implement all this, which is quite a lot of money, and especially in U.S. sort of transportation government dollars.
Right. Yeah, I do like how SF Park, you've made all the materials available with an eye toward, others being able to replicate them. So I thank you for that contribution to the greater good.
Thank you for the reminder of posting them in the chat, which I'll try to remember to do right now.
Yeah, please do. Lindsey, tell us about the deal in Chicago.
Okay, I guess I had only been living here a year, so it was 2008, and the city pretty quickly passed a deal to sell off the rights to all of the metered parking spaces across the city for $1.15 billion. And there is some flexibility, but really it was that case of not having the political will to raise prices on the street. The city needed money to fill budget gaps. They couldn't afford to modernize the meters, so put in the pay boxes on their own. So they saw this as getting a large infusion of cash, and then the meters were modernized, but then they lost all of the revenue that would come from that. And it's for 75 years, so I'll be 104 when it's all run out. And with over 60 years left in the contract, the private company has already made back everything that they paid, plus 500 million. So it's definitely an example of this is very valuable land and you can use it better. So I'd like to think that maybe Chicago's terrible decision in 2008 helped motivate San Francisco to do it a little differently. And it is, like I said, it is a little bit flexible. The city can raise or change the rates, but the contract says that if the money that they make goes down, the city is on the hook to pay for that. So they're very resistant to making experimental changes and really thinking about changing the price to match demand and having that efficient balance as you can have in San Francisco. So that's where we are with that.
Yeah. So note to other cities, don't do that. Not a really good idea. I know I did work with the bike program at the city of Chicago, and just being able to take away a few parking spaces to create protected bike lanes, just added a whole other level of difficulty to the work, because they basically have to replace them, right? If you take a space, you have to create a space somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. And so I think the city's approach now is figuring out where they can add new metered spaces so that they would be able to do more projects like that. But it also does give the aldermen a more of a power dynamic. So if they don't want bike lanes, they don't have to figure out where to put new meters. And I mean, they've always had that power to get in the way of different changes to the streets.
Yeah.
But it makes it harder.
Nice. So someone in the chat was asking about dynamic pricing, and I don't honestly know. Do you know how widespread is dynamic pricing? I know Seattle has been doing a kind of a simpler version of dynamic pricing, just going out and counting parking spots regularly. Do you have a sense? And maybe Michael, you can jump in. I think our hope was that this SF Park, this dynamic pricing model would would spread really rapidly to other cities. And I would say the uptake has been slow. Is that fair?
Well,
What's your sense?
That's fair. I mean, I could jump in on that one. That I mean, at the risk of sounding pedantic, which I do too often, that we do call it demand responsive pricing and not dynamic pricing. And we kind of made that decision because dynamic pricing we view as more like the high occupancy toll lanes where the price changes in real time. You know, specifically like the rule here on this toll lane is that we want to keep the traffic moving at 40 miles an hour. And so if we need to up the price right now, the price goes up right in the middle of rush hour to keep traffic moving at 40 miles an hour. We don't do that. We don't say like, oh my gosh, this block is really crowded, so the price is going to go up right now. It's demand responsive. So we take a block of time, like a month of data, we look at it, we say, what was the occupancy on this block, and we'll set the price going forward based on that. And that was on purpose, partly just because it's easier technologically to do, but more so because we wanted people to react over time and give them time to internalize the fact that this block now costs more or costs less, and make their transportation and travel decisions based on that. There are other places that have a more trimmed down version of dynamic pricing. There's some in New York, there's Seattle you mentioned, Berkeley, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, has kind of like a value pricing and a premium pricing that So there are a few cities that are doing that sort of thing, but I'm not. LA also has a program called Express Park that they were rolling out a couple of years after SF Park, especially focused on the downtown, trying to do the really block by block pricing that San Francisco does.
Yeah, so I think Alan Greenberg chimed in the chat to say nobody really is doing dynamic pricing. So I think that was my lack of finesse in the question, that I think demand responsive is a better descriptor for what cities are actually doing. Okay, I have one more formal question, and then we'll turn to the questions in the chat, or sorry, in the Q&A. If you have questions for the panelists, please stick them in the Q&A. We already have several coming up. Oh, Michael's here. Michael, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, since you called on me.
I did call on you. I see you were paying attention, right? You weren't like,
yes. I was wrangling my brain to see where in the world have we seen dynamic pricing, and it occurred to me in following the SF model. SF I think was increasing the prices every 3 months to give some predictability to drivers, and all of the systems that we followed, in fact, was more along the lines of demand responsive pricing and giving the public some time to adjust. So, yesterday you didn't arrive and pay one price, and tomorrow you arrive and you're paying another price. And before you left your house, you made a decision about whether you're going to drive or not drive based on what the price is. And so that made me think about how to get public buy-in into a pricing scheme in the first place. And in a lot of places, we just saw this in Vancouver, where they came out with the staff in the agency came out with a climate emergency parking plan to price the curb, and specifically to offer residential permits based on vehicle emissions. And we saw that the public outcry was pretty great, to be expected. And the mayor ultimately decided not to go forward with the plan. So the plan also, though, included provisions to cross-subsidize public transit and cross-subsidize cycling infrastructure, and increased space for walking. And we've seen in our work in Mexico City with the Eco Park system, not only communicating that this on-street parking pricing system is an environmental program, and it would give drivers more convenient access should they choose to drive, but we're going to take the money and then invest the revenue into expanding walking space and into supporting sustainable transport. And so I wanted to ask the panelists, in your experience, have you seen this is what makes pricing more palatable to the public? And should that kind of approach be limited, because ultimately you might want to use those parking spaces for something else in 2 to 5 years.
There's a lot in that question. I would say, I'm thinking of small suburban downtown, not quite ready to fully go on board with demand responsive pricing or things like that. But I worked with one community, they did have the old fashioned meters, and we could tell that a lot of their employees were parking at the metered spaces. They even had metered lots, and we would see, the Starbucks vest and putting the coins in. And so we got them to switch out to a pay box, and they weren't ready to do the whole town. So they just did this one lot. And the day that meter went live, the village hall ran out of the hang tags for free employee parking. And so they knew right away that little switch in one lot had an immediate effect. So I think that taking a baby step there was really helpful to show that price is going to motivate people's behavior. And so while they haven't done it yet, and it has been a few years, the idea is that they could expand that to other streets because they don't want their employees parking and feeding the meter.
Yeah, in Boulder, many years ago, they developed the idea of a parking space equivalent, that somebody taking the bus was, basically the equivalent of providing another parking space. So they used the downtown parking revenue to buy bus passes, eco passes for everyone, all the downtown employees. Okay, Hank, you should answer Michael's question. Let's go to our last question, which is not a simple one. And then we'll go to some questions from the audience.
Okay, so you want me to?
I want you to answer Michael's question, if you remember what it is.
Yeah, well, I think I can fake my way through it. No, but well, I mentioned at the outset that San Francisco has this unique setup where where excess parking revenues do go to fund the transit system, which is very progressive and forward thinking by the voters back in 1999. And we also, it's an interesting case because we do get a lot of requests. I get a lot of requests when I go out and talk to various community groups. Why don't you set up a parking benefit district? Why don't you let some of the revenue from the parking meters or the parking permits in our community come back into our community with, for new street trees or sidewalk improvements or whatever sort of public benefits you want. And the response is, well, we actually can't do that because of the city charter, but also the city already is a citywide parking benefit district. The excess revenues go to make the transit system better, to run more lines, to run more buses, to clean them up. And I think that's becoming an increasingly sort of convincing argument to folks. And the other advantage, the other way that SF Park and demand responsive pricing has made it easier to talk about parking pricing with the public is that we reduced rates in a lot of areas. And so, you get that sort of, it's kind of a man bites dog story, like when's the last time you saw a city reduce parking rates since they started charging for parking back in the 30s or 40s or whatever? It doesn't happen. And so we actually did that. And so we could credibly say, we're not here to try to just increase the price just a little bit to extract more money from you. We're actually trying to set the price, the lowest price available that creates the availability targets that we're aiming at. And so that I think that helped. I think that built some credibility and some trust with the community. And so those are sort of the two hooks I think that have been useful. I am personally, and I think as an agency, we do want to lean more into that. Like, if we start charging in more places and at more times, that means we can run more buses and more trains. And to the extent that we can really draw that connection more closely, that will help our argument. Because I think even when we say that, a lot of people say, I'm not sure I believe that. It sounds like this just goes into the general fund and then, the black hole of the SFMTA's budget, and who knows what comes out the other end. And to the extent that we can say, these millions that we raised by extending parking meter hours into the evening actually, brought back the 31 bus that we had to remove during COVID-19, or actually meant that we went from 8-minute headways to 6-minute headways on this line that everybody rides, so. Yeah.
Lindsey.
I just wanted to put a plug in for one of the projects that the Parking Reform Network is raising money for, is to publish a pretty in-depth study of parking benefit districts, looking at case studies and what worked well and how to do them in your community. So that is one of the things that we hope to release pretty soon.
Great. Okay, my last big question. Let's talk about curbside management. How pricing can help with the competing demands at the curb. And we know with COVID, those demands have even increased. More deliveries. We are already dealing with the TNCs, the Lyfts and the Ubers, the desire to carve out space for bike lanes, for transit only lanes. Now, streeteries, restaurants in the streets. It's pretty complicated. Can you give a fairly brief overview of those dynamics and what you're doing about them? Maybe Hank?
Sure.
I know this is a good question for you. I was
yeah.
fascinated by your answer in our practice session.
Well, let's see if I can replicate it. The biggest thing that we've done recently is that part of the creation of the curb management team that I described, one of our first tasks was we created a curb management strategy, which is a citywide policy document that said, okay, rather than being reactive and just sort of responding to requests from businesses for loading zones and things like that, we're going to be policy driven, data driven, holistic and strategic in our thinking about how we manage the curb. And we're going to start doing it. We're going to start planning rather than just reacting. Our board of directors, the agency's board of directors, passed a curb management strategy that our team drafted back in February of 2020. It's a document that we're very proud of. I'll put a link to it in the chat. February 2020 was, of course, right before COVID hit, so we haven't really had time to enact any of the recommendations that are in that document. Mostly because the team that wrote it and was going to do all that has been completely taken over by what we call the shared spaces program, basically the streeteries program in San Francisco, which has been huge and popular and a really high priority for the business community and the mayor. So that's sort of the one way that's one way. And there's an important kind of chart in that document that says, here are all the different land uses in San Francisco, and here's how we prioritize curb use. And what you'll see is that access for people and access for goods is the top priority in basically any land use type in the city, and private car parking is pushed pretty far down to the bottom. And that the idea is that this is sort of letting everybody know these are what our priorities are. This is the most efficient use of the curb. You've probably heard ideas like curb productivity or curb efficiency measures, where you say, a passenger loading zone or a transit stop or a commercial loading zone can deliver a lot more people and goods than a private car parking space that a car is parked at for 2 or 4 hours or whatever. So trying to prioritize things that are more productive and more equitable over things that aren't. But I think a key piece of that, and the big piece that's missing, is that for the most part, we don't charge all of these new users of the curb anything for that curb usage. For TNCs and on-demand deliveries and parcel deliveries and things like that, they're all stopping wherever they want to stop, and the only price they pay is the rare parking citation that they get when some parking control officer catches them double parking. And so we got to figure out a way to price those users so that they can pay their fair share, so that we can, again, funnel that money back into transit and bike share and all the things that make San Francisco easier and safer and more efficient to get around. So that's my answer there.
Yeah, I want to follow up just briefly about the streeteries, the restaurants using the street space. New use. I mean, I know you'd been doing parklets. San Francisco had been doing it on a small basis, but in most cities, pretty significant new use. From my perspective, better than private car parking, higher, better use of that space. And yet it sort of now occupies a whole bunch of space that could be used for deliveries, could be used for EVs, could be used for bike lanes. But now we've sort of grandfathered in a whole new use. Are there tensions around that?
Definitely. Again, I agree with you. Very, very exciting. And, I tell my team, especially if they get frustrated with all the work that's required, or perhaps a business owner isn't as appreciative of this new space as they feel like they should be. They're like, hey, let's not forget that this is sort of the message that we've been trying to get out for a long time, and now everybody gets it, right? Or at least everybody on commercial streets in big cities gets the idea that, oh, wow, there's a much better use for this curb space than private car parking. You can fit 20 people. You can make lots of money off of it. You can employ people to go serve those tables in that streetery space. But I do think that once those are all embedded and they're sort of like baked into a restaurant's business model, that it becomes more challenging to, if you ever have to move that space or take it away to put in a bike share station or a new transit zone or a protected bike lane or something like that, because it's a pretty solid and embedded thing that someone spent tens of thousands of dollars to put up, and for which they're depending for a lot of their revenue. I mean, we've built in rules around that, saying, you know, these are temporary, and if they have to be moved for some other sort of higher transportation need, then we'll take them away. But it remains to be seen sort of what that's going to look like in discussing with actual merchant associations and merchants. So, I mean, we're already doing some of that as we transition from a temporary to a permanent program, saying, hey, you know, you got to move this zone back because it's too close to the intersection. You have to move the zone back because it's sitting on top of a storm drain or something like that. And as you can imagine, those conversations run the gamut. Some people totally get it and make the changes right away, and other people say, nope, you're not going to take away my space.
Yeah. Okay, Lindsey, quick response on that. We have a bunch of questions that we're, again, not going to get to. I'm sorry. But
Sure, yeah. So in Chicago, we had done one street. We completely redid it prior to the pandemic to have sort of that walkable feel. It's called Fulton Market. And they eliminated curbs. So the whole roadway is the same height, and it's very easy to walk across or use a wheelchair. And when the pandemic hit, there are a lot of restaurants there, and they were able to very easily just completely change that street with the restaurants and block it off and to cars, so that it's just filled up with people and activity. And I think that it's been hard for us to convince business owners that anything besides vehicle storage would be maybe a different use would benefit them, but they were able to see it because of these changes that we were able to do on the ground. And I think just having that and examples where you're not going to do that to every street, but that we can innovate and we can make changes to some areas. I think that has been helpful, because as cities, we are very space constrained and cars take up a lot of room. So I'll just let us move on to the questions with that. But
okay, I'm going to ask a question, and I'm going to ask my cohort, Michael Kodransky, to ask a question. So with more EVs coming, will on-street parking undergo change? Are you really thinking about incentivizing EVs through curb management, or is that just, you know, where is that in the mix?
I was looking at the chat, but I think you were saying that the EVs, and are we incentivizing it?
Yeah, is that part of the conversation of how do you manage curb space to incentivize EVs?
So the one big piece of advice that we've had for communities that are putting in EV parking, they're often, we were saying, don't put it at your most convenient spaces and don't make it free, because people will just leave their parked EV in the space all day. So we want to make sure that you have the turnover, but we are looking at ways to incentivize EV parking and general provision of facilities for electric vehicles, because they are going to be part of the solution.
Hank?
Yeah, I think similarly, and it's sort of a similar discussion to what I was just talking about with the on-street dining zones or the streeteries, is that an electric vehicle charging station is a very expensive thing that requires a lot of infrastructure that kind of locks in that curb space for that one specific use for maybe decades. And because especially our commercial curbs are so dynamic and changing so much in the way they're used and the users right now, that we're reticent to lock that in. And so to the extent that these need to be on street at all, we should focus them on the residential streets, the places where we can feel pretty confident that we're not going to be, you know, there's not a lot going on some of these residential streets. They're probably not going to be a bus lane going down that's taking all the parking, or an outdoor dining zone or something, because there's no businesses adjacent to it. And so, and that's also has the advantage of that's where the people live. And in San Francisco, I think the biggest challenge is lots of people live in places that don't have off-street parking. And so they don't have any place to pull in and plug in their car overnight. So it makes sense to bring the EV charging stations closer to where people live.
Great. So how about, Michael made a suggestion to me. How about the idea of automated license plate based enforcement? I know New York City's looking at that. They have huge issues with police and city vehicles, placard abuse, people parking in all the wrong places. It's hard to enforce. It's hard to set up programs for EVs, to incentivize EVs, unless you have that kind of really data-driven approach. Are you looking at automated license plate enforcement, and are there equity issues around that?
Yeah, I can say from the city perspective, we're pursuing that pretty aggressively. Our residential permit parking system is going to move to all license plates, so you won't have the little sticker on your back bumper anymore. And then it will be enforced exclusively with license plate recognition technology. And also, we just completed a new contract to replace all of the parking meters in the city, and so half of the city is going to be pay by license plate. So you enter your license plate number when you pay, and the parking control officer vehicle has the LPR equipment installed and just scans a license plate, and that tells them whether the vehicle is paid or not. There's definitely equity and sort of surveillance concerns, and so we have a lot of safeguards around that. Mostly just that we just don't save the license plate number. We replace it with a unique identifier, and then we delete the license plate number immediately. And that's because otherwise, you'd have concerns about tracking and things like that. So I think it's really, the LPR is in a lot of ways foundational to some of the more innovative stuff that we'd like to do, especially around residential parking. That we have to be able to have the pricing connected to your license plate so that we can make changes quickly. We can charge you a day rate or a monthly rate. We can change around the zones if we want to. All that kind of stuff that would make a lot of sense from a policy perspective really isn't possible if you're just out there looking at stickers and writing tickets.
Lindsey, is LPR coming to Chicago?
I am not sure if they are looking into LPR in the city. We have worked with suburban communities that have bought the technology. Some of the things that they talked about were that they one particular community didn't do a good job working with their enforcement officers to bring the technology online, so they were resistant to using it. And so there's really an important step of making sure your enforcement officers want to do that and working them through all the technical glitches, because they're the ones that are going to have to put it on the street and make it work. But I would think the city would want to be on it because of the meter deal. They get all the revenue from tickets. So if you can make it easier to collect that, they would benefit, unfortunately.
The financial incentives around parking create really interesting dynamics for cities, don't they? Yeah. You want to do less parking, but it's a revenue source. At this point, let me toss this back to Michael and Ivona. We might go a few minutes over. I know a lot of folks will have to leave on the hour, but Michael, why don't you ask a final question, give us some wisdom. I mean, there's a ton of great questions. Again, we will try to go through and give answers and post them later, because we can't get through each one of your questions is like 10 minutes of discussion.
Yeah, I think the questions, the number of questions and the quality of the questions illuminates how this is only the beginning of the discussion. And in many ways, ITDP got involved in parking because we looked at things like city responses to 1970s air quality regulations, and places like San Francisco were applying versions of parking supply caps in downtown districts. And so we saw, okay, well, with transportation emissions climbing and being among the leading contributors to the climate emergency, could we approach parking in a new way in this new era where the crisis is so clear to us? And it's not just air pollution anymore. So in fact, my question is related to that. What do you imagine is the opportunity to have parking policy resonate for more accelerated action from municipal governments, regional governments, state governments, and even policy guidance at the federal level to have that kind of blunt response to the urgent crisis?
So I'm going to just jump in with Tony's story from Portland in this sense of it's so easy for people to be against change. And what Tony did in Portland was bring together people on different topics to attend council meetings and to speak up for things that they would want to see. And I think that's what we're trying to do with the Parking Reform Network is create a larger audience that can go and say, you know, I'd like to see things differently. I'd like to be able to bike with my kids to get to their school and to work, and just getting the word out so that we can build the political will, which is usually what stops us from making these changes.
Yeah, it strikes me that there are really smart people working within cities, within agencies like Lindsey and Hank and others. And if there were just a little bit more from the report, you know, what was clear, if there was just a little bit more of a public push from outside advocates to go to elected officials and say, we need to do more about parking, it would let, you know, the folks inside agencies move faster, get more done. Hank.
Yeah, I think you know, Lindsey certainly hit the nail on the head in terms of the getting the motivation. I would just chime in to say that, and I think I talked about this at our earlier session, that it feels like zoning to me, and how zoning sort of, a lot of people are waking up in the last few years to the fact that, oh, these zoning rules are what is preventing us from building in a walkable, sustainable, denser way. And, you know, even if I wanted to build an apartment building on my plot of land, it would be illegal because the zoning is what prevents that. And that those zoning rules are just created by a planning commission and approved by the city council many, many years ago, and people didn't think about it. And parking rules are the same way in a lot of cases, that, you know, even if you wanted to build your building with no parking, or even if you wanted to add a space in your basement to allow your mother-in-law to come live, you wouldn't be allowed to, because that space has to remain a parking space. And if you don't add 2 more parking spaces because you added a new unit, then it's illegal to build that unit for your mother-in-law and sort of allow more space and you know, multi-generational living or whatever you want. And so I think, but people are starting to get it, you know, like the California state legislature has passed a few things that have loosened those zoning rules and kind of trumped local restrictions that require us to build, you know, single family homes on big lots. And I think that there's an opportunity to do something similar with parking as well, to just if nothing else, to sort of loosen up the requirements, let people do what they want to do. If people want to build parking free and parking light places, or they want to add to their existing, you know, houses, that let's let them do it.
Okay, some closing thoughts, Martha. Well, thank you to the panelists. This has been a really robust discussion, and if there's any wisdom really that has come out of all of you from this discussion, I would use a line that Martha used: all roads lead to parking. We need to continue to elevate it as a policy area that deserves much more prominent discussion within policy making. ITDP has just, this is a plug, released on-street parking management guide that is global in scope and is meant to allow cities to understand what kind of business model is possible, what kind of regulatory governance model is possible based on international best practices. And I'm going to lift up a piece of wisdom that Hank shared, which is, if we start charging in more places and over more times, we can run more buses. And that's the crux of it. If we deal with parking reform on street and off street, then we can tackle the climate crisis and equity and spatial justice issues and affordable housing. And so thank you for this discussion. And you know, we might host more discussion on on-street parking, because the questions are pretty robust and on a lot of different topics that we didn't even get to.
Thank you, Lindsey and Hank.